Hello, everyone. Good morning. Happy St. Patrick's Day. And welcome to this morning's program. I am Sarah Blanchette. I will be your moderator today. And I hand it over to Julie Rayner to do the introductions.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our March How Did We Get Here educational program. This program is sponsored and presented by the High Point Historical Society and the High Point Museum. Like Sarah said, I am Julie Rayner and I'm the secretary of the High Point Historical Society. The How Did We Get Here series is an educational experience that takes a current topic, exploring it through the progression in time and how it ties to High Point and our surrounding community's history. Here are a few housekeeping items for today. First off, we will begin with our speaker making a presentation. Then we will follow up with some question and answer session. Please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. And it would be great if you could include an email address in case there isn't time to respond today, because if we don't get to your question, we will answer those directly in email afterwards. And Sarah will be leading the Q&A session. Today, we're going to learn about the Mendenhall family and their involvement in the North Carolina abolitionist movement. Leading our exploration today is Shawn Rogers, director of the Mendenhall Homeplace. And here's a little bit about Shawn. Shawn was born and reared in Terre Haute, Indiana. As a young child, his grandfather instilled in him an appreciation and curiosity for history that survives to this day. He descends from several lines of Quakers who worshiped at New Garden, Spring, Cane Creek, and Napton Friends meetings. In fact, he is a descendant of Mary Mendenhall Newland, sister to John Mendenhall, the patriarch of the Mendenhall family in Jamestown. As a student, he earned a Bachelor of Arts degree with a double major in History and Political Science from Indiana University, and a Master of Science degree in Historic Preservation and Heritage Interpretation from Eastern Michigan University. He worked as a museum educator at Greensboro Historical Museum for 4 years and is now approaching his 9th year as director of Mendenhall Homeplace in Jamestown. He's married to Heather, a local attorney, and has an 8-year-old daughter named Rachel. Shawn, we welcome you and thank you for leading us on this exploration.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate the introduction, and it's good to be with you this morning to talk about the Mendenhall family and their involvement in the abolitionist movement. I'm going to be using a few visual aids here by way of PowerPoint presentation, so if you see me veering off to the side, you'll know why. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's see if I can. Okay, well, let's start at the beginning. Well, as close to the beginning as I really feel like getting to at this point in the morning. Jamestown, okay, well, Jamestown, as far as European settlement is concerned, essentially began with a young man named James Mendenhall. James Mendenhall was a young Quaker who lived just about 38 miles west of Philadelphia at East Calm Township, Chester County. His grandfather, John Mendenhall, who was referenced earlier, was a patriarch of the family here in Jamestown, came over as early as 1783 with William Penn, to Penn's colony, of course, and settled at what became East Calm Township and was one of the founders of Concord Friends Meeting. James, his grandson, was a young miller. As a matter of fact, the home that he first lived in that was built around 1714 still stands there in what is now Downingtown, Pennsylvania. And behind the home place is the remains of the first mill that he had constructed. Mendenhalls were a long line of mill rights and makers. And at any rate, James, as early as 1759, along with many other Quakers, found his way down the Great Wagon Road to what is now known as Deep River. By 1762, he receives a Granville grant deed to over 240 acres of land. And that was located basically where High Point City Lake Park is today, most of the lake itself, as a matter of fact. By 1765, he had constructed a substantial frame dwelling place, a grist mill, a sawmill, which quickly made that area a popular spot, a gathering point for commerce and other such activities. James, by 1775, moves south to Georgia to help establish a Quaker meeting there known as Wrightsboro. And in the interim, he leaves the estate to his son, George Mendenhall. We'll refer to him as George Sr., just as a matter of clarification. We're going to be talking about James Cameron here shortly. George, at least according to family tradition, George decides to convert his home, which is right at his doorstep, is right at the old Salisbury Stagecoach Road, which led down to the county seat of Rowan. Of course, this area was in the county of Rowan previous to 1771. So it was a relatively well-traveled thoroughfare. So he decides to take advantage of this fact and start renting out rooms in his home as an inn. And actually does quite well. It's an excellent stopping off point for wayfarers and people who are traveling down the Salisbury Road. And does really well, like I said, much to the chagrin, now this is according to family tradition, of a rival innkeeper named John Haley, who lived just several miles up the road. Some of you might be familiar with that name. And according to family tradition, and some of this is actually borne out in the documentary evidence, John Haley convinces his former peers who were on the Guilford County Commission to call road jury regarding the Salisbury Road and its path. And it's decided that the road will be moved almost a full mile south from George Sr.'s home place, along a new path, the new Salisbury Stagecoach Road. George tries numerous times to have this tabled and have the decision reconsidered, but to no avail. So George, he kind of takes he takes a look at the situation, assesses things, and says, well, okay, if you're going to move the road away from my home, my place, I'll just move my place to the road. So he looks into purchasing property or acquiring property on either side of the new Salisbury Stagecoach Road. And much to his surprise, he finds out that he already owns a great deal of it. You see, his father, James, had purchased a sizable tract from the heirs of Richard Beeson shortly before moving to Georgia. He dies there in 1781, so George had unwittingly inherited that property. And Mary Browning, local historian, actually found an affidavit dated 1783 in which it's proven that that property was actually sold to James. So not too long after, we're going into the mid 1790s at this point, George lays out a town, and he lays it out on a grid, much like the great Quaker William Penn had done in Philadelphia, with roads intersecting each other at right angles, and with the main thoroughfares being Scientific going north and south, and Federal Street going east and west, which is today Main Street. And these town blocks formed by these intersecting roads were subdivided into half-acre lots, and many of those lots were doled out to or given to George's children, one of which was Richard Mendenhall. And that takes me, sorry, to the Richard Mendenhall place. Richard actually had made improvements here before his father's death in 1805. He has willed the property upon his George's death in that year. He's given 4 acres, essentially 4 town lots. The old home place for many years was referred to as Mendenhall Plantation. However, it never was a plantation. If anything, this represents early town living, where many of the home places fronted Main Street with what I like to call side hustles located in the back, stables, blacksmith shops, in Richard's case, a tannery and a pottery, more than likely. As a young man, around 1794, George sends his son Richard back to East Calm Township to learn to be a potter. Long story short, and by 1800, he returns a potter and a tanner, or at least it's believed he was a potter. A kiln site was discovered not all that long ago, just west of the home place near the Schubel Coffin house, or I should say the Coffin Robbins Tilden home. Okay, so Richard, like many Quakers, was an abolitionist. He was an outspoken abolitionist. As a matter of fact, he had an ongoing correspondence with Benjamin Lundy, who by 1821 had established the well-known abolitionist periodical known as the Genius of Universal Emancipation. And Richard was influenced by and had great influence on many of the local abolitionists in the area. So there's the old home place. Let's go forward. Okay. And my 1816, well, let me kind of set the stage for this first, for the North Carolina Manumission Society. Few people realize this, but beginning in 1777, with the passage of the North Carolina Act to prevent domestic insurrections, going all the way to the end of the Civil War, it was essentially illegal to free or manumit enslaved people within North Carolina. And of course, the main reason for that is the threat to the institution of slavery in this area. Slaveholders were threatened by the prospect of having freed formerly enslaved people living near their slaves. They were worried about insurrections. They were worried about the influence they may have on their quote unquote property, their chattel. They were worried that recently freed enslaved people would spread these crazy ideas about rights and freedoms and other such things. So to that end, it was basically illegal to free or manumit slaves in North Carolina. The best you could do legally would be to acquire, through act of or resolution in the state legislature, permission to, or in some cases in the counties themselves, permission to quote unquote carry off freed individuals. And the idea was they wanted enslaved people carried off at such a great distance that they would never return, or the odds of them returning would be relatively low. So, and to add to that difficulty, in different times throughout this period between 1777 to 1865, there were sizable costs or fees that had to be paid to acquire permits to help enslaved people free, servitude here in North Carolina and other such places like parts of the old Northwest Territory where slavery was not allowed, had been prohibited as early as the late 1700s. So, facing all these difficulties, a number of Quakers, weighty Quakers, influential Quakers, gathered at Center and actually founded the North Carolina Manumission Society. And Richard Mendenhall was actually one of the co-founders of this organization, which was mainly active between 1816 and 1834. By 1834, much of the leadership in the organization had migrated north. Okay, back to the Richard Mendenhall house. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you a little bit about some of the interesting features in the home. For generations now, it's been rumored that the Mendenhalls were involved in the Underground Railroad. The use of these secret or clandestine pathways or network of pathways and safe houses leading north to freedom for freedom seekers. And there isn't much concrete evidence for that, to be quite honest. And that's especially in regards to documentary evidence, which is not unusual when you're dealing with something like the Underground Railroad, which was underground. It was clandestine by nature. So few people left written records behind of such activities. There are very few instances where that actually happened. Think about it, it's like with Al Capone, you don't keep ledgers of your illegal activities. That's a good way to leave a paper trail for yourself later on. Cause a lot of trouble for yourself and the movement. At any rate, for years, visitors and even volunteers at Mendenhall Homeplace, formerly Mendenhall Plantation, had pointed to an old hatch door on the first level in the old parlor of the home as a trap door of sorts where fugitive enslaved people hid in the cellar. I have a hard time believing that. Really hiding in the cellar, hiding in a loft, that's akin to hiding underneath your bed. It's one of the first places that someone would look. Okay, but we do have this interesting feature. And one of the reasons why I'm sharing it with you is that it's an element that's in common with at least 3 other individuals who are have been associated with the Underground Railroad. One being Narius Mendenhall, Richard Mendenhall's son, who was born and reared in the home place. There were rumors that he harbored fugitive enslaved peoples at his home, Mendenhall Oaks. That has not been substantiated. Also, we know that there was a man named Alfred Wheeler and his wife Lydia, who had a home not more than 4 or 5 miles from the Mendenhall home place. And they had a son named Alonzo, who around 1938 had an article published in the Indiana Magazine of History. And in it, Alonzo, who's about 89 years old at that point, reminisces about growing up in or near Jamestown before and throughout the Civil War. By 1867, he and his family had migrated to Hendricks County, Indiana. But he talks about the old home place that they lived in. It was called the Old Starbuck Home Place. And he talks about how his father was involved in this network of freedom, okay, helping people, enslaved people, escape north to freedom. And in this little article, he references the primary hiding place in the home. And he basically describes it as follows. He said that there was a porch roof that extended from one end of the back of the house to the other that formed an attic space of sorts, accessible or accessed by a low door in the large bedroom upstairs. And when I first read that, the hair on the back of my neck stood up, because the description was very similar to a feature that's found in the Richard Mendenhall house. And here it is. This is the hall chamber upstairs. And I hope you can see my little cursor here, my little arrow. You see this large door? Just outside the door is a porch roof that goes from one end of the back of the house to the other, which indeed does form an attic space that's accessible by this low door. Now, previous to that veranda being added on the rear of the house in 1849, this was just a full door that went nowhere. Of course, we're on the second story, keep in mind. So if you walked out of this door, you're hitting the ground. Doors like this were often referred to as a dead man door. And a dead man's door, because, you know, the first step is a killer. The primary reason why you'd have a door to nowhere, well, number one, it gave you options for later construction. Say you wanted to add a second tier porch or another portion of the home, which Richard actually did at the front of the home. You may have noticed in the earlier photo that there's an old Tidewater 2-tier porch at the front. But mainly why you would have this door to nowhere is in a lot of these earlier homes, you had these very tight corner stairs. When I say tight, it's the one in this house is very, very narrow, very steep. You would have a hard enough time getting a chair up it, but a large piece of furniture, no dice, it's not going to happen. So this gave you an option of hoisting it up or lowering it down. Now, in 1849, after this porch is added, once again, you have this space. And this is where it gets interesting. Not long after I had read this article that was authored by Alonzo Wheeler, it was actually about 10:30 at night. I grab my ladder, I go back to Mendenhall, and I get up and I look, I take my flashlight over the beams that are actually visible now that beadboard had been removed years ago, so you can actually see the joists themselves. And above the timbers, there are the remains of cut nails and rows of nail holes, which indicate that there were indeed floorboards in this little storage area of sorts. Now, Alonzo goes into detail about how this is used. He talks about how freedom seekers would actually go from one safe place to another. And these safe places usually weren't as sophisticated as this. In many cases, they were just dugout creek beds or river beds or caves. In some cases, people literally hid under stacks of hay in the middle of fields. Once again, not usually in cellars or attics. So let's go to the next slide. Here we go. So you see, you have this low door, and it looks to be a relatively tight space, but when you see it in person, you'll realize that how relatively easy it would have been to crawl in and out of this space. And I hope you see that it looks kind of dark on my screen, but you see the joists? That's where the rows of nails and nail holes are. Okay. So they would go from one safe place to another. When they came into the old Starbuck home place where the Wheelers lived, they would be spirited away to this little attic space, very similar to what you're seeing now. And of course, this is done under the cover of darkness for obvious reasons. And In this attic space, they would have food, water, blankets, and other such things. And the individuals there would actually do the best they could to rest during the day. And then at night, they would come out and sometimes socialize with the family. And if they were lucky and if it was safe enough, they would move on to the next safe place. Generally, the safe places weren't more than 8 miles apart because you didn't have to go too far, especially under the cover of darkness from one place to another. Okay. There's a view of the low door from down below. And there's actually one piece of the beadboard still here. So you have to imagine there would be floorboards above these beams and then beadboard down below. Now, the other people who had, that I referenced earlier, who had features like this in their home, Narius Mendenhall himself at the Oaks. Unfortunately, the remains of that building are about to be razed. And I was able to salvage the small door that actually opened up into a roof attic space at the rear of the home. And there's also appears to be signs of access to the front porch as well. And the other individual is Levi Coffin, whose 1831 house in what is now Fountain City, Indiana, used to be Newport. It had a low, has a low door that actually enters into a garret, which is part of the pitch of the roof. See the knee wall here where the young man is climbing out? Now, do we know that this was used as part of the Underground Railroad? No, we don't. But it's one of those intriguing things that you sometimes happen upon that really makes you wonder. Richard, you know, it's been pointed out by others in the past, when Richard passed away in May of 1851, in his memorial, it essentially said that his place, his home place, was a safe haven for many people, regardless of their legal status. And for me, that pretty much sums it up. Okay, now I'm going to talk a bit about Richard Mendenhall's younger brother, George Cameron Mendenhall. He's quite of a controversial figure. His story is complicated, to say the least, and we're learning more and more about it. He, as early as 1824, in 1824, married a young woman named Eliza Webb Dunn, a Methodist Episcopalian. And contrary to what you may have heard recently, George Cameron was actually disowned by Deep River Friends meeting. However, he was not disowned because of the ownership of enslaved people. You see, his wife, when she was just 2 years old back in 1803, had inherited close to 40 enslaved individuals as property. And those people came into the marriage and really under the ownership of George Cameron Mendenhall in 1824. That is not why he was disowned. He was disowned essentially because he married out of unity. Early Quakers had this suicidal policy of if you married out of the meeting or out of the meeting without permission, you would be disowned. You especially didn't want to marry out of the faith, someone who was not a member of the Religious Society of Friends. That's not to say that didn't have a determining factor in their decision to disown George Cameron. But nonetheless, I just wanted to clear that up because I've seen that a lot recently. George Cameron actually, along with his wife Eliza, were abolitionists who actively opposed slavery. Eliza, you know, according to George's second wife was Delphina Gardner. I'll get to her in a moment, but a good friend of hers, Ellen J., actually wrote that George's first wife, Eliza Dunn, was very close to George's brother, Richard Mendenhall, and shared many of their radical views on slavery, especially in regards to abolition. As a matter of fact, few people know this, and this is one of the newer pieces of newly discovered pieces of information I'd like to share with you. In the old North Carolina Mission Society minutes, draft petitions going back to when Eliza hadn't even reached majority. She actually drew up these drafts to petition the county court in Montgomery, where she was from, to have standing as a minor, so she could free slaves that or enslaved people who she had inherited. It's another indication of. And also, what happened, unfortunately, Eliza, about a year or so into the marriage, actually it was about 2 years into the marriage, by 1826, she gave birth to a young son named James Ruffin Mendenhall, and did not survive post-childbirth. And when she died, George already had his hands full. He's doing everything he can to help establish these people as families at the home place, and did not do a great job of it. I think it was just quite simply more than he could handle. These rudimentary log houses where dirt floors were put up on the bluff above the old home place, and so many of the people could live together as families. Those sites are currently located on the shore of the High Point City Lake. Now back to the North Carolina Mission Society. I didn't get into that very much. I wanted to just go back and revisit that for a second. The North Carolina Mission Society basically was formed in reaction to some of the laws that made it difficult for people to manumit enslaved individuals. And what the Manumission Society did is these weighty Quakers who pulled their resources, financial, legal, and otherwise, to, in some cases, acquire slaves, often on behalf of the yearly and monthly meetings. And they took advantage of some of the loopholes in the current laws. For example, enslaved people were treated as property. So in some cases, they actually developed property trusts. So enslaved people could live basically virtually free until arrangements could be made to move them out of North Carolina. They also raised funds to help people acquire permits, so that the enslaved people under their care could be moved out of the state. Also, and this is somewhat controversial, especially now looking back, they dabbled in what is known as recolonization. For example, George Cameron, I think it was in May or June of 1826, let me, I'm jumping ahead of myself. The North Carolina Mission Society, what they did on a few occasions, they actually secured the use of ships, generally off the coast at New Bern, and a ship's crew, and they would take a number of enslaved people who freely chose to do so. They were put on the ship and sailed to these democratic farming colonies that were established for this purpose. In example, Liberia, Africa, there was a ship called the Nautilus that Nathan Gardner, another brother of Richard and George's, that was shipped to Liberia, that had over 164 people on it, enslaved people. They also, in 1826, getting back to George, first he had these 10 individuals as a family, and he wanted to free them. And so he's kind of wrestling in his mind with how am I going to accomplish this legally? almost everything that George Cameron did, he was a lawyer, keep in mind. He was also a circuit court judge for Guilford County. So he tried, everything he did was pretty much on the straight and narrow, was within the legal confines of the law. And what he did is he discovered that, oh, I'm sorry. Well, anyhow, I lost my train of thought there. Okay, thank you. So what he did is he was trying to come up with ideas of how he can free these people legally. And he even considered selling, doing a token sale to his own brother, Richard Mendenhall, who at the time was the president of the North Carolina Manumission Society. I think the sale was for $10 for these 10 individuals. And the draft deed for this are actually found in the minutes of the North Carolina Manumission Society. Eventually, what happens is 9 of those 2 individuals end up on the verified manifest for a ship called Sally Ann that sailed out of New Bern and ultimately ended up in Haiti, where a democratic farming colony had been established. Now, by 1832, George Cameron Mendenhall marries Delphina Gardner, who's a solid Quaker by all accounts. In fact, the famous Quaker poet John Greenleaf Whittier once referred to her as a quarterly meeting in and of herself. And a lot of people give her credit for persuading George Cameron Mendenhall to free many of the enslaved individuals that came under his care. But, you know, as I demonstrated earlier, George and his first wife, Eliza, were working to free these people early on. But Delphina, I think kind of, at least in George's mind, temporarily threw a wrench in the works. You see, what happened was she subscribed to a lot of these abolitionist periodicals, and she realized what was going on in Ohio and Indiana. Basically, you would have these large landowners, and people would take their enslaved people and help them travel to Ohio and Indiana and basically drop them off to their own devices. And many of them didn't know much about basic household economy, farming, and other such things. So these many unscrupulous landowners would take advantage of this, and they would offer them a home to live in exchange for a percentage of the yield and the crops on the property that they let them use. And what would happen is these people, if they lost 1 or 2 of their crops, they basically fell into another form of slavery, peonage, which is basically slavery through debt. She understood this, so she teamed up with George, and they decided to start training a number of these people in trades, so that not only could they work to help pay for their own passage north, but they also learned trades and skills that would prove valuable to them and their families once they did ultimately make it mainly to Ohio. Well, for example, one of the individuals, they called him Uncle Cal, Calvin Mendenhall. He was trained in the mercantile trade and ran the old Richard Mendenhall, well, actually it was George Cameron Mendenhall store in the Richard Mendenhall store that is now catty corner from the Richard Mendenhall house at High Point, Sea Lake Park. I worked there for 9 years. Another individual was a champion harness maker. On an annual basis would win the award at the state fair for the finest harness in mining. Narius Mendenhall, who was the eldest son of Richard and Mary Peg Mendenhall. It's an interesting guy. He got himself in trouble because he started following a lot of the Wesleyan Methodists who were coming down, people like Adam Crooks and Jesse McBride. And Quakers, for the most part, were considered philosophical abolitionists. Wesleyans, not so much. They were fire eaters, okay? They came down and stirred up a lot of trouble for many of the Quakers in this area. Narius quickly fell in with this group, was enthralled by the message that people like Adam Crooks and Jesse McBride were sharing at these 9 and 10 day camps that were established in places like near what is now Sandy Ridge Road and the old Union Meeting on River Road in Jamestown, and even at the old Jamestown meeting house. that is now located in the City Lake Park. So anyhow, what happened was, as late as 1857, a man named Rowan Hinton Helper basically created an economic treatise called The Impending Crisis in the South and How to Deal with It. And it truly was an economic treatise. It didn't really deal much with the wickedness and immorality of slavery as so much as the economic pitfalls of the institution of slavery in the South. And it was quickly outlawed. And Narius got himself in trouble because people were sharing the fact that Narius was sharing leaflets from this book, which was illegal. The book was quickly outlawed by the state legislature. It was legal to even have excerpts of the book on your person or in your personal property. And they took him in, they arrested him. He had his day in court. And while he was being held, while he had his day in court, his wife, Oriana, gathered up every scrap, every piece, every excerpt, every book, and burned it in the back lawn of the home. And thankfully, for lack of evidence, Narius was released. Okay, Eliza Mendenhall, the daughter of Richard and Mary Pegg, married a man named Dr. Nathan Branson Hill, who was a brazen, outward abolitionist and got himself into a lot of trouble. He also was spreading these leaflets that had excerpts from the impending crisis of the South, which had been outlawed. And one night, a group of men showed up at their home. Well, Nathan was actually at one of these camp meetings. And Eliza immediately understood what was happening. So she had a large meal put out. She invited them in, kept feeding them food. And in the meantime, she sent one of the house servants to Nathan and with the message that her mother, Mary Pegg Mendenhall, was deathly ill and to rendezvous at the old Richard Mendenhall house, which they did. As soon as the last person was gone from the table, she quickly packed a piece of luggage, grabbed the children, and headed off to the Mendenhall Homeplace, where she met her husband, and within an hour, they were on a train headed to Indiana, which they eventually settled in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where they lived out the rest of their lives. Okay, Richard Junius Mendenhall, another son of Richard and Mary Pegg Mendenhall. There's an interesting story about him. His cousin, James Ruffin Mendenhall, you might recall, who was the son of George Cameron and Eliza Dunn. He actually was against the idea of freeing the enslaved people who were owned by his father. He saw them as his rightful inheritance. And what happened was one of these individuals escaped north. So James reached out to his cousin, Richard Junius, and asked if he could accompany him as he went north to try to capture this poor man. And so Richard Junius says that he consulted with his father, who of course was an ardent abolitionist. His father was all for it, if anything, to make sure that James Ruffin was safe, and also, just as importantly, that the escaped individual would accomplish his goal, which is ultimately what happened. Richard Junius chronicles their adventure as they go up through the mountains and eventually make their way to Cincinnati and then Richmond, Indiana, where they gave up and then turned back south. One of the local newspapers in Richmond actually published an account and having a lot of fun at the expense of the young man, Richard Junius, the son of an ardent abolitionist, and James Ruffin, the son of a Southern slaveholder. And they basically say something to the effect of, these little Bo Peeps from Carolina came up north to find their sheep, and it turns out that they were the ones who walked back south with their tails wagging behind them. Cyrus Mendenhall, I include him, if anything, as a study in contrasts. in a lot of ways, he turned away from the Quaker faith. He married out of unity. He married a young woman named Nancy Staples out of Stewart, Virginia, who was a Methodist. And the story is told, is passed down from the family, is that he was disowned, or was about to be disowned for participating in a marriage outside the confines of the Quaker faith. And he had a chance for redemption, to redeem himself, to go before the Quaker meeting and repent. And he supposedly he shows up with his letter, his prepared remarks, and one of the elders inquired as to what he had in his hand. He goes, "Oh, well, these are, the remarks I'm going to give in regards to, redemption." And the elder goes, "Oh no, we have remarks for you." And they supposedly hand young Cyrus this piece of paper. And according to the story, it gets to the second paragraph where it mentions that he is to apologize for falling in love with his wife. And so according to the story, he just rips it up, throws it in the air, and walks away, never returns to the meeting. In a lot of ways, like I said earlier, he turns away from the Quaker faith. For example, during the Civil War, he teams up with two rifle makers, Ephraim Jones and Grafton Gardner, and establishes the Mendenhall, Jones, and Gardner Rifle Factory on Rock Creek Dairy Road, eastern Guilford. It eventually is relocated to where Oakdale Cotton Mill is today in Jamestown. He eventually secures a contract to make 10,000 rifles for the Confederate States of America, for their army. Not very Quakerly, as you know. Quakers have a peace testimony to uphold. And also, when he married Nancy, a number of slaves came in to the marriage. I don't know whether he actually purchased slaves or not. I think that's a matter of contention among a few people. That's something I'd like to look into further. But anyway, a number of the descendants of the slaves of Cyrus and Nancy Mendenhall, and also George Cameron and Eliza Dunn, have got in contact with Mendenhall Homeplace and Historic Jamestown Society. And I've actually tracked down a few myself, and we're looking to learn more about these stories so we can share them with you. Okay, real quick, I know I'm just about finished, but I wanted to mention something about the Stanley Murrow wagon, which we have in our possession at Historic Jamestown Society, Mendenhall Homeplace. And it was, and it's not believed to have been owned by Joshua Stanley, which has been recently reported. It was. There's an established provenance for this piece. It was under the care of 4 different families, each understanding and knowing exactly what it was, and realizing the importance and the significance of preserving it. It eventually made its way to Historic Jamestown Society after the death of its last owner, James Edgar Murrow. Okay, so its original owner was Joshua Stanley and Abigail Hunt Stanley, who were early abolitionists, Quakers, who also played a key role in establishing New Garden boarding school, which became Guilford College. At any rate, as early as 1835, this wagon was used to help fugitive slaves seek freedom in the North. It's called a false bottom wagon because it literally has a false floor, which creates a hidden compartment that goes a little bit more than halfway back through the length or the depth of the wagon itself. And what's ingenious about this is that there are 2 boards that slide in front. And these old farm wagons, rarely would these boards be removable. They were usually nailed shut permanently. And it was filled with pottery and hay. And in the back where the tailgates, where the tailing boards are, you could pull those up and all you would see would be the pottery and the straw. And according to a number of accounts, Joshua Stanley's, well, at least by the 1840s, 2 of his teenage adopted sons, Isaac Stanley, who happened to be his nephew, and an orphan named Andrew Murrow helped dozens of people reach freedom in the North in this particular wagon. And basically the way it worked, they used these young boys, teenagers, sometimes younger, to ride in the wagon itself. And first of all, few people would suspect that these young people are running slaves north, but also it was a common sight for people on the roads leading from Deep River, North Carolina, which this particular wagon was located in southern Guilford County near Center Friends Meeting. But from that area going all the way up to southern Ohio, it was common to see these young people hauling leather and also pottery. Pottery, even back then, was highly prized. North Carolina pottery in particular, it was of high value. So a lot of it was carried north. And the reason why many of these potters would send their younger children to deliver them is that they, quite frankly, didn't want to stop turning and burning pottery for a month or so in order to make that trip. So, you know, fugitive slave catchers, federal marshals enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act, they were used to seeing these younger folks, so they were rarely stopped. Now, what would happen is they would usually have one or two scouts on horseback leading out in front of the wagon, and the freedom seekers themselves would often be behind the wagon at a distance, out of sight as much as possible, or even flanking the wagon itself, depending on the terrain and the ground cover. Like if you're in a deep forested area, sometimes they would be walking right alongside the wagon and looking down at the road, and they can actually see and hear it. So what would happen is if the scout saw something that concerned them, like a roadblock or just a grouping of suspicious individuals or something, they would ride back and tell the boys, and the boys would either stop the wagon if the enslaved people weren't too far off, and then they would open up, pull the boards, they would crawl underneath them and replace them. Or in some cases, they would have to turn back and rendezvous with them at a farther point. But nonetheless, once they were secured in the wagon below, in the compartment, they would essentially roll through the area of danger, the roadblock or what have you. And when they were reached a safe place, it would start all over again. And we know that Isaac Stanley and Andrew Murrow in particular helped dozens of people escape north in this fashion. And we're glad to have it at the Richard Mendenhall Homeplace, a historic Jamestown society, of course. It's one of only two authenticated false bottom wagons anywhere. The other is at the Levi Coffin home in Fountain City, Indiana. Okay. And these are just some photos from Mendenhall Homeplace, the old Pennsylvania style bank barn, and we'd be glad to have you when you feel safe enough to visit. Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shawn, for sharing really important and interesting history. We have a few questions for you.
Excellent.
We have one from a 4 times great-granddaughter of Richard Mendenhall. She would like to know that when she comes to visit Jamestown and visit Mendenhall Homeplace, if there are any books regarding the history that's actually for sale there.
We do have some works that were published by our historian, Mary Browning. So we do have a few examples of books and texts that she could purchase or peruse.
Wonderful. And then one question for clarification.
Mm-hmm.
Someone wanted to know, who was George C. Mendenhall's father?
Oh, I'm sorry. George C. Mendenhall's parents were George and Judith Gardner Mendenhall, George being the founder of Jamestown, and the son of James Mendenhall, the town's namesake.
And then did George have any older siblings?
George Cameron? Yes.
George C. Mendenhall.
Yeah, George, yes. Richard being one of them. And of course, we have the Richard Mendenhall Homeplace. Also, he had a brother named Nathan, who was a leader in the North Carolina Manumission Society, was a talented millwright and mechanic. He also was a surveyor, and I'll just briefly mention that Nathan Mendenhall was one of the early commissioners for Guilford County. And as a surveyor, he was actually charged with finding the exact geographic center of Guilford County, because at the time the courthouse was near Martinville, which is basically, the north central part of the county, north central, northeast section. And so a lot of people were complaining about having to go all this distance. They wanted a more equitable or fair location. So he finds the exact geographic center of Guilford County, and lo and behold, it's in the middle of a marsh, a duck pond, basically surrounded by a marsh. So he takes a short walk south, and he realizes that the land, it's higher and it's flatter, and he secures a tract of land on behalf of the county from a man named Ralph Burrell, and he proceeds to lay out the town of Greensboro, which becomes the new county seat.
Interesting. How did George C. Mendenhall's legal career evolve, and did he handle any cases involving slavery differently over time?
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I failed to mention that earlier. He was pretty consistent in his defense of those, and also basically aiding those who were trying to manumit their slaves. Okay, I'll give you an example. I mentioned earlier the Wesleyan preachers Adam Crooks and Jesse McBride. He successfully defended them in court. There were a lot of people in this area that wanted to see them swinging on the end of the rope. They were causing a lot of trouble. Like I said, not only for slaveholders, but also for a lot of the Quakers in the area, because they would come in and rile people up. And this anti-slavery, basically fomenting a lot of this anti-slavery fire and brimstone kind of activist fervor. And then they would leave town. They would go back to Ohio. And then a lot of the other Quakers are left going, hey, they basically received the brunt of the reaction of it, the aftermath. So he successfully defended people like Adam Crooks, Jesse McBride. But one of the stories I think is really interesting and really quite powerful. He defended a fellow Quaker by the name of David Beard, who of course ran the famous hat shop at Deep River, just near the old Deep River Friends meeting. And what happened was the home guard or patrol were tracking down this group of runaway enslaved people, and they found them in one of the buildings at the David Beard hat shop. They were hiding under a pile of rabbit pelts. As a matter of fact, it was described that a little brown elbow was peeking out from the base of this big pile of rabbit pelts. And so they pulled out a couple young people and their mother. And in court, during the closing arguments, reportedly, George Cameron Mendenhall appealed to really everyone's appreciation of a mother's love for their children and their desire to do everything in their ability to protect them and make a better life for them. Well, anyhow, by the end of his closing arguments, and this has been reported from several different sources, there wasn't a dry eye in the entire courtroom. The judge himself, the jurist, the prosecutor were crying. So needless to say, David Beard walked out a free man that day.
All right. We have one more question. You mentioned that Andrew Murrow was the adopted son of Joshua Stanley. Were they related?
They were not. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Andrew Murrow. I was pressed for time, so I kind of cut that part out. But Andrew Murrow, it turns out, had a son named Joshua Stanley Murrow. Okay. And Joshua Stanley Murrow had a son named Roscoe Murrow. And Roscoe Murrow had a son named Egbert. And old Egg did not like his name one bit. I think he was only about 6 years old. He lived at Polecat Creek near a Center Friends meeting, actually lived was born in the home of Joshua Stanley. Okay, so he knew that wagon quite well. It sat in the barn behind where he grew up, or at least for a short time. When he was 6 years old, his father Roscoe got work in the shipyards in Washington State, so they moved there. Well, young Egg, he got tired of being called Egg, Mr. Egg, Egghead, you get the picture. So by the time he had graduated from journalism school, he had changed his name to Edward Roscoe Murrow, who of course was a pioneer radio and TV news journalist who broadcasted live from the roofs of London buildings during the Blitzkrieg, won a Peabody Award for his reporting.
Well, that was a lot of information, but it was a lot of really good and interesting information. So thank you so much, Shawn. I will hand things back over to Julie to close things out.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you again, Shawn, for sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you for all the attendees who stayed to listen and for your interest and support of the program. Once again, this How Did We Get Here educational series was presented by the High Point Historical Society and the High Point Museum. And the High Point Historical Society collects, preserves, and showcases the history of Greater High Point to foster a shared appreciation of our community reflected in the stories, events, and traditions of our past. We extend our invitation to you to join our organization. You can find membership information on the High Point Museum webpage, as well as information about upcoming programs. This program and other programs in this series have been recorded, and the links can be found on the High Point Museum's website or on their YouTube channel. And our next How Did We Get Here program will be Exploring with the Old North State Detectorist Club, Rediscovering the Past with Rodney Joslin on Wednesday, April the 21st at 10 a.m. Registration information will be available soon, and we hope you'll join us. If you're in the area, please stop by the museum and explore High Point's history. We're currently open on Saturdays. And also stop by the Mendenhall Homeplace in Jamestown. Thanks again to Shawn Rogers, and we hope you have a wonderful day.